The afternoon they locked the door in my face. The cold had that late November eastern suburb kind of bite. Not fierce enough to feel grand or cinematic, but needling and persistent, slipping through my collar, through my pant legs, through the skin at my wrists, until even the hand holding the key no longer felt like it belonged to me. I turned into the familiar stone drive leading up to the house in Westport I had called home since I was 6, and for the first half-second, my brain still couldn't quite process what I was seeing. 3 brown cardboard boxes set beside the front step, a black rolling suitcase I used for short work trip, 2 garbage bags tied shut with red string, swollen with clothes stuffed in too fast. The bay laurel in the ceramic pot my mother used to keep on either side of the door had been pushed off to one side, as if someone needed space to stage the belongings of a person being expelled. The front door was closed, the first-floor shutters were open, and right there in the side-light glass, I caught the reflection of my stepmother, Elaine Mercer, standing straight, one hand resting on a new lock that still gleamed. I climbed the first 2 steps, my mind still scrambling for a decent explanation before fear could fully take shape. I slid my key into the lock. It didn't fit. I tried again. Still nothing. When I looked up, the door opened from the inside just enough to leave a narrow gap, and Elaine stood there in a cream cashmere sweater, dark trousers, her hair smoothed back as if she had just come home from lunch at the club instead of throwing my things out onto the porch. Behind her, my brother Dean leaned against the dining room doorway, one hand holding a glass of water, his face so calm I almost didn't realize that calm was the first slap. "You don't live here anymore," Elaine said. No shouting, no shame, no hurry. Just a complete, gentle, clear statement, carrying the weight of something she had repeated in her head often enough that by now it sounded like law. What I remember most vividly isn't the new lock, or my belongings tossed outside, or even Dean's face behind her, as if he were standing by to see whether the scene would play out the way he wanted. What chilled me most was the look in their eyes. No panic, no guilt. They thought they were right, and when people who have just done something cruel to you believe they're justified, the war that follows is always longer and dirtier than any explosion. My name is Emma Mercer. I was 35 the day I was locked out of my own house. 36 the day a judge forced them to open the door and let me back in, and older by decades in the parts of me nobody ever fully sees, even after I won. The house stood in northern Westport, Connecticut, not showy in the way new money tech mansions are, but rich in an older, quieter way, and because of that, far more enviable. Gray stone over timber, a navy-painted door, a deep-sloped roof, tall panes of glass looking out onto the row of maples behind the yard, a kitchen big enough to haul. My entire childhood, a living room with a stone fireplace where my father used to fall asleep in his armchair with the Wall Street Journal spread over his chest. An oak staircase I once flew down on Christmas mornings, once sat curled up on to eavesdrop on adults fighting, once stood frozen on the night my biological mother was driven away to the hospital and never climbed again. To anyone else, it was a multi-million-dollar New England suburban prop. To me, it was the only thing in my life that had ever taken the shape of a complete place. My father, Martin Mercer, was not an easy man. He worked in land development and commercial investment, spoke little, cut straight, trusted order and ledgers more than declarations of feeling. After my mother died of a brain tumor when I was 14, he seemed to know no way left to love me except through structure. He made sure tuition was always paid on time. My tires were changed before winter. The heat never went out for more than one night. And whenever I called too late from the city because something was wrong, he didn't say much. He only said the same thing he always had: "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." Some fathers never learn the language of tenderness, so they pour all their love into presence and responsibility and hope their children will know how to translate. I lived on that translation for more than 20 years. Maybe that's why I believed him when he said, in small, steady ways over many years, that the house would one day be mine, not in some grand declaration, by the fire, or an imagined reading of the will, just in the middle of ordinary life, and precisely because it was ordinary, I believed it. Once he stood with me on the back porch watching men repair the roof after an October storm, the smell of wet wood and hot tar still in the air, and said, "One day this will be yours to worry about." Another time, when I moved back from Brooklyn to stay with him during the last stretch of chemotherapy, he sat at the kitchen table, both NDS wrapped around a mug of tea, his shoulders sharper from illness, and said almost irritably when I asked whether he had arranged anything for the house, "Emma, The house is yours. Stop asking me like I'm already dead. I stopped asking after that. That was my mistake, a very human one, and ruinously expensive. Elaine entered my family when I was 27. After 3 years of barely living at home because I worked in Manhattan and only came back on weekends. She didn't arrive like a storm. She arrived like background music pleasant enough that no one notices when it has taken over the whole room. My father met Elaine at a hospital fundraiser in Stamford. At the time, she was doing development consulting for a few nonprofits, speaking with just enough warmth, dressing in exactly the tasteful widow but not yet register, knowing the names of major donors, knowing how to tell a personal story in a way that made the listener feel uniquely seen without ever revealing enough of her own center to be vulnerable. The frightening thing about Elaine was never crude greed. She never took anything with a rough motion. She only made everyone else feel it was reasonable for her to appear more and more often in places that had never been hers. A knit coat of hers on a kitchen chair, a new herbal tea in the cabinet, a guest list she had helped your father sort through for Thanksgiving dinner, a different tablecloth, prettier, subtler, replacing the one my mother used to like. She never spoke badly of my mother. She didn't touch the old photographs in the first year. She never pushed me to call her mom, never even pretended to want that. She was too smart to invade bluntly. She chose usefulness, chose reassurance, chose to stand right beside my father as he began to weaken in his early 70s. His blood pressure unstable, his heart no longer sound, and having someone remember his pills, his lunch, his appointments, the social calls he had to return became the most seductive thing in his life. At first, I even tried to be kind. I truly did. I ate dinner with them. I thanked Elaine when she brought soup upstairs to my father. I let her believe she could manage the gardener, reorganize the pantry, choose the wine supplier for Christmas dinner. I thought it was the price of my father being less lonely. What I didn't see then was that people like Elaine never treat another person's kindness as a gift. They treat it as space. Dean, my brother, was 4 years older than I was, and the perfect version of the eldest child in upper-middle-class families addicted to appearances. Confident, courteous with outsiders, resentful in private, always knowing exactly whom to call when he needed a door opened, and spending his entire life with an unspoken conviction that anything bigger than himself had ultimately been designed to fall into his hands somehow. Dean was not evil in the cheap, cartoon villain way. He was far more dangerous because he genuinely believed the story he told, believed he carried more, understood our father better, deserved more, believed I was the younger sister who was too emotional, too slow in big decisions, too attached to what he called sentiment. Dean studied business, worked at a private equity firm for a while, then left to start his own company with a few flashy deals that sounded far more substantial than they really were. My father propped him up more than he ever admitted. Small bridge loans, quiet phone calls, introductions, moments of silence when he knew Dean was moving money between accounts in ways that would have been called reckless if anyone else had done it. I knew because I was the one who still sat with my father after dinner, listening while he complained of being tired and let slip details he imagined were unimportant. And I also knew Dean had never loved the house the way I did. To him, it was a core asset. Beautiful, valuable, useful, saleable, financeable, divisible, optimizable. Something to keep if convenient and unload if profitable. To me, the house was the last thing still holding the shape of a family, before we all began turning one another into instruments. That difference sounds abstract until the lawyers start speaking in numbers. Then it becomes something strong enough to leave a younger sister standing on the porch in the cold. My father died at the end of October, not suddenly like an accident, but not slowly enough to give us the clean version of goodbye people imagine. A pulmonary infection after months of a weakening heart and failing kidneys. I had moved back into the house 9 months earlier to take care of him, giving up my rented apartment in Brooklyn, working remotely more and more, then gradually cutting back projects until I lived around pill times, meal times, doctor visits, physical therapists, and the shrunken schedule that begins to orbit the slowing body of an old man. Elaine always reminded me, lightly as air, that she was grateful I was there. But she never let me forget that she was the legal wife, the one signing forms, the one listed in hospital records, the one called first. When my father died, Elaine was the one sitting at his bedside. I was the one who came running up after hearing her call, barefoot on the cold wood floor, and saw only that his chest had stopped rising. Dean arrived 40 minutes late, tie crooked, eyes red, the smell of cologne and airports still clinging to his coat. We each grieved in our own way, if what Dean and Elaine did can even be called grief. I couldn't cry right away. I stood in the bedroom doorway, looking at my father's hand lying on the white blanket, the fingers long and dry. No longer the hand that had once steadied the back of my bicycle, and the first thing I felt was fear. Not pain, fear. Fear because in the instant he was gone, the house lost the one moral axis that had ever made me feel safe inside. In the first 3 days after my father's death, Elaine behaved like the steward of a court under a new ruler. Not loudly, not by shoving anyone aside in public, but wherever a decision had to be made, she was already there, had already called, had already arranged it, had already changed the hour, already instructed the staff, already spoken with Jonathan Pierce, the family's longtime lawyer, already called the bank, already taken the safe keys, already told the florist whether to use white lilies or pale roses. The house had never been this quiet, but the quiet did not belong entirely to mourning. It belonged to reorganization. I noticed as early as the second night that Elaine was already sitting in my father's study, laptop open on the leather desk, the stack of estate files on her right, the landline pulled closer to her hand. She looked up when I stood in the doorway. "I'm just trying to make sure nothing gets missed," she said. On the desk, beside my father's old letter opener, lay the key ring for the house and the safe. They had always been kept in the bottom left drawer. Now they were at Elaine's hand. "I can help," I said. "I'm sure," she answered, eyes never leaving the screen. "But there are things that are easier if one person handles them." The phrase "one person" hung in the room long enough for me to understand that she was already redefining the order of the house without ever needing to announce it. I didn't argue then. I was too tired, too raw, too stupid, because I still believed that what mattered would ultimately be resolved according to what my father had said. In wars like this, the greatest mistake is often not trusting the wrong person. It is realizing far too late that they have already begun. 7 days after the funeral, when the flower deliveries had stopped and the cook had slipped back into the rhythm of ordinary meals, Elaine walked into the kitchen while I stood at the sink staring out at the backyard, where the maples had nearly dropped everything, and said, "We need to talk about the house." I turned around. "What is there to talk about?" Elaine set her espresso cup down on the stone so gently the touch of porcelain barely made a sound. "We need to be practical." "Practical about what?" "About the house being too large, the upkeep not being insignificant, and your father." She paused, selecting the word, "having changed his plans toward the end." I felt my stomach draw tight. "My father told me the house would be mine." Elaine looked at me with the kind of compassion I would later learn to hate more than any shouting. "Martin said a lot of reassuring things when he didn't want conflict." "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means, sweetheart, that you're remembering an emotional promise as if it were a legal instrument." The sentence was thin enough that it almost didn't look bloody, but it cut anyway. I stood there, my hands still wet, the smell of lemon dish soap and bitter coffee in the air, and for the first time saw exactly what kind of strategy she would use. She didn't say my father had never said it. No, she merely changed the category of truth, turned promise into emotion, reality into interpretation, my memory into something that could be re-explained by the person holding the paperwork. "Where are the documents?" I asked. Elaine lifted her eyebrows the slightest fraction. "Jonathan is reviewing the estate. I'm asking about the documents related to the house, and I'm telling you the lawyer is handling it. I want to see them." "Not now," she smiled. "You need sleep more than you need to read trust documents in this state." That was the first act of gaslighting wrapped so beautifully that if I repeated it to someone else, they might think I was petty for reacting so strongly. But I had grown up in that house. I knew instantly. She did not just want to shut me out of decision-making. She was beginning to shut me out of my own right to trust what I knew. 2 days later, Dean came in for the weekend and fell in line with Elaine so quickly there was barely a transition at all. I won't say he was manipulated. That would let him off too easily. Dean chose. We sat in the breakfast room, pale sunlight slanting through the row of windows, while he pushed a stack of photocopied pages across the table. "Dad made updates," he said, in that bored tone people use when they want to sound as though they are doing something difficult but necessary. "Elaine's the primary beneficiary on the residence." I turned the top page over. It wasn't the formal deed, not at first glance. It was an estate summary packet with an attached transfer directive and a statement giving Elaine exclusive residential rights. It looked legitimate. Notary seal, lawyer's name, my father's signature, everything too neat, too clean, too perfectly, the kind of paper people wave in front of you when they know you're in too much pain to read closely. This isn't right, I said. Dean leaned back in his chair. Based on what? Your feelings, based on what he told me. Repeatedly, Dean gave a short laugh. Emma, Dad told everyone what they needed to hear when he was sick. Elaine rested her hand on his, lightly, ostensibly soothing, but enough to make me feel that in the eyes of the two of them, I was already becoming the difficult one. No one is trying to hurt you, she said. Then why do I feel like you're waiting for me to disappear? Elaine exhaled, her eyes dimming by exactly half a shade. Because you're turning grief into suspicion, Dean cut in. You're not entitled to anything just because you attached yourself to the house. I turned fully toward him. Attached, yes. Attached. Dad dying doesn't turn the property into some emotional museum. I looked from him to Elaine, from Elaine to the stack of photocopies. The flaw in it still didn't have a name, but it was there. A date that felt off, a slightly different font on the last page, the notary seal sitting over the signature in a way that didn't look natural. Enough to lift my instincts, not enough to win. And that is the most dangerous zone, the place where you can feel something is wrong but cannot prove it yet. So if you speak too early, you look insane. People like Elaine thrive in that zone. They began building a family front against me with astonishing speed. Elaine called my father's sister first, then 2 aunts on Long Island, then his old friend from the club. I knew because my phone suddenly filled with messages that were soft and sour at once. We all process loss differently. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be. Elaine has been through enough. One aunt even called me outright and said, in that dense tone of pity only older, wealthy women can produce, "Darling, if Martin wanted the house to be yours, he would have made it clearer." I hung up without answering. They didn't see the things I saw. They saw an elegant widow, a reasonable eldest son, and the unmarried daughter who had moved home to care for her father and was now refusing to let go of a property. The story they needed in order to sleep was too tidy to inspect. By the end of the second week, I had almost no one openly on my side except Nora Stein, my closest friend since college, who worked at a nonprofit housing clinic in New Haven and had the rare habit of listening to an entire story before deciding whether the person in it had lost her mind. "Do you think the paper is fake?" Nora asked me over the phone while I sat on the back steps, a mug of cold tea in my hand. "I think part of it is real, part of it was altered, or it's being used to tell a false version of something else. Then stop arguing until you have something harder. I can't just sit there and watch them talk about the house like I don't exist." Nora went quiet for a beat, then gave me the sentence that saved me from my first major mistake. "If you keep reacting like a daughter who's been betrayed, they'll lock you into that role. You have to start reacting like a beneficiary whose rights are being taken." The words made me sit upright. The pain was still there, but it changed shape, from something that only tore inward into something with edges. The day they actually locked me out, the morning had looked so normal I almost hated it for that. I went into the city to meet a former client from the firm where I used to work, to ask about a short consulting job. It was cold but bright, the kind of brightness that makes people stupid enough to believe the world still has some order. Elaine even texted me at 11:12. "Don't forget the florist is delivering at 3. I may not be here." The last sign of counterfeit normalcy. When I drove back around 4, Dean's SUV was parked at the curb. A locksmith's van was behind it, and 3 cardboard boxes sat on the porch like body parts, staged neatly after surgery. I got out of the car, froze for a second, then ran up the steps. The door wouldn't open. My key wouldn't catch. Elaine appeared behind the glass before I could pound a second time. Dean stood behind her. They were both in house clothes, as though they wanted this to sound like a difficult family decision rather than a seizure of access. "You don't live here anymore," Elaine said as she cracked the door open. "Are you insane?" "Emma," she replied, almost pitying, "we discussed this. You can't do this." Dean stepped forward, not exactly pushing ahead, but enough to make the door seem reinforced by steel. "We can." And we did. "This is my house." "No," he said, "it isn't. Not legally. And the worst part is you keep acting like saying it louder makes it true." I lunged half a step forward. Dean lifted one hand, and from the street, a local patrol officer who had already been standing near the locksmith's van started toward us. That was all, just the presence of a uniform. They had called ahead. They had prepared the story. The officer, tired and decent in the way of someone who clearly knew this was a civil matter he hated standing inside, asked me to lower my voice and explain that the current residents had changed the locks, that they had preliminary papers establishing residential authority, and that if I attempted to force my way in, he would have to treat it as trespass pending dispute. I looked at him, then at Elaine standing in the doorway like a small saint of order, and understood the second half of the nightmare in full. Not only did they believe they were right, they had prepared enough for other people to temporarily have to treat me as if I were wrong. That night I slept in a motel off I-95 with 3 sweaters, my laptop, a paper notebook, and a small box of old photographs I had shoved hastily into one of the cartons. Not because I couldn't afford a better hotel, but because I was in no state to choose according to taste. I sat on the bed with sheets that were too white, listening to the old air conditioner rattle in the wall, and for the first time in years, let myself cry not because my father had died, but because something worse had happened right after. I had been erased from the house he had left me before he had even cooled inside other people's memory. Wise, the next morning, my face swollen, my head aching as if someone had struck it with a hollow piece of metal, I went out to the parking lot, sat in the car for 15 minutes without driving anywhere, then called the county clerk's office. I didn't know what I was looking for. I only knew the papers Elaine and Dean had shown me were too clean. And in complicated inheritance matters, too clean is often a sign that someone has swept the dust away. At the land records office, a silver-haired woman behind the glass read the address, then turned the screen toward me. The recorded owner of the property was not Martin Mercer, not Elaine Mercer, not even estate of Martin Mercer. It was Mercer Residence Trust. Date transferred into trust, 13 years earlier. I stared at that line until my vision blurred. I want every scan related to it, I said. The woman looked up. All of it, all of it. The trust certificate, original deed into trust, tax exemption rider, amendment updating the successor trustee 4 years earlier. All of it slowly emerged from the printer, still warm with machine heat. And right there, in the middle of language as cold as ice water, was the thing that shifted the gravity inside me. Martin Mercer had not personally owned the house since the year it had been put into trust after his first heart episode. He held a lifetime right of residence. After his death, the successor trustee would execute the transfer of occupancy and title under a supplemental schedule. And the first named successor trustee was not Elaine. It was me. I had to sit on a bench outside the records office for 10 minutes just to keep from being sick. Not because I was thrilled, but because I fully understood the scale of the game that had just been exposed. They had not simply pushed me out by invoking widow's rights. They had pushed me out of an asset my father no longer even held in absolute personal ownership, the way they were claiming he had. Worse, if this trust certificate was valid, then the packet they showed me was either half real and half false, or it was using some peripheral document to tell an entirely false story about actual authority. I called Nora. My voice was so cold and unsteady it sounded strange even to me. They're not the owners. Nora was silent for 2 seconds. Where are you? County office. Don't go back to the motel. See a lawyer. I don't have one. Now you do. An hour later, thanks to Nora, I was sitting in Sophia Reyes' office in Norwalk. Sophia handled trust disputes and residential title litigation, had black eyes, hair twisted into a low knot, and a voice as flat as stone steps. She read through the stack I had brought her, offered no promise and no comfort. She only tapped her pen twice against the desk and said, "Okay, good news first. They're not owners." I almost laughed because the word good felt luxurious at that point. Bad news, Sophia looked up. People do a lot of damage before a court makes them stop. Then she flipped to the amendment at the back, pointed to a clause I had read without fully understanding. Your father retained occupancy, but the house was held outside probate. That means if they locked you out relying on estate paperwork, they either don't understand what they're holding. She paused, lifted her eyes to mine. Or they do and they're hoping you don't. I asked the stupidest, most human question I could have asked then. Am I crazy? Sophia barely reacted. No, you're just late. From that point on, the real war began. And the middle of it looked nothing like the victory montage outsiders like to imagine when they hear the phrase legal comeback. It looked like a pressure chamber slowly squeezing the oxygen out of you while still requiring you to dress properly, answer emails in the right tone, work a few hours here and there so you could keep yourself afloat, and make sure nobody noticed you were shaking so badly you had to sit on one hand to keep your coffee cup steady. Elaine and Dean did not retreat when Sophia sent the first letter demanding reinstatement of access and a halt to any attempted transfer or encumbrance. They countered so quickly, it proved they were not naive. A large firm in Stamford took them on that same week. We received a response nearly 30 pages long built on exactly the strategy I should have guessed from the start. They did not dispute that the trust existed. They argued that my father had exercised a reserved power under a separate, incompletely filed supplement, transferring beneficial control to Elaine while he was still alive. That I held only an expectancy interest, not a present possessory right. That changing the locks had been protective estate preservation in light of my emotionally destabilized conduct. I read the phrase emotionally destabilized conduct and felt my hands turn hard. They were doing exactly what Elaine had begun in week 1, translating my response to being dispossessed into symptom. A woman thrown out of a house, crying, pounding on the door, calling relatives, demanding documents, suddenly becomes someone unstable enough to justify barring her access. If you don't understand how powerful that kind of manipulation is, it's because you haven't watched someone use your pain itself as the legal basis for inflicting more. Elaine did not stop the social campaign either. She invited certain relatives over for tea in my house, let them see her moving lightly around the kitchen, asking the gardener about spring tulips, sighing that I haven't been myself since Martin got sick. Dean was cruder, though always just polished enough to avoid seeming vulgar. He called 2 old mutual friends and said I was spinning out, that I had misread the paperwork, that I was fixated on the house because I hadn't accepted my father's death. One old friend texted me, "I heard you're suing Elaine while she's still sleeping in your dad's jackets." I sat staring at the message in the little temporary office I had rented at Bell Structure Studio, where I had gone back to taking short design contracts just to keep my mind from disintegrating, and for the first time felt social humiliation take on physical shape. It didn't explode, it pressed. It made walking into a coffee shop in my old town feel as if every chair had subtly angled itself a fraction toward me. It made me wonder whether I was imagining people staring, and then hate myself for even asking the question. Sophia had no patience for that kind of fog. "Stop reading what they say about you," she told me while we sat on her office floor amid towers of files, cold pizza, and 3 paper cups of coffee. "The court doesn't care who hosted tea, but the jury of real life does," I answered. Sophia looked up from her laptop. "Then let real life be embarrassed later. First we get your house back." The first real crack in their story came from something so small that without a lifetime spent around paperwork, most people would have missed it. The notarized signature on the so-called exercise of retained power Elaine was relying on the date my father was in the ICU under heavy sedation, and not incapable of signing the consent form for the procedure I had helped read to him. Sophia got the medical records. I had photos of the hospital wristband with timestamps, because in desperation, people save everything without knowing yet that they'll need it. We matched the times, matched the nurses' names, matched the visitor log. My father had been at Yale New Haven from 8:14 that morning until 9:32 that night. Elaine's document had been notarized in Greenwich at 11:40 a.m. that same day. Her lawyers argued it might have been signed earlier and notarized later. Sophia only gave that thin little smile of hers. "Not on an instrument like this." Then we found something worse in the metadata of the scan. The PDF file had been created 2 weeks after my father died, scanned on the new office machine installed in the study, under a user profile tied to Dean's personal assistant. Dean submitted a supplemental declaration, claiming it was only the digitization of pre-existing original. Sophia smiled the way people smile when they've just found a fracture that reaches bone. "Then where are the originals?" They never appeared. Not once, and each day that passed without them forced their explanation to balance on yet another layer of fabrication. People like Elaine are often excellent at the first layer. It's the third layer onward that begins to smell. I confronted Dean once in the driveway, 2 weeks before the first hearing. It was bitter out, the grass yellow, the sky low, and my car remained parked outside the gate because Sophia had instructed me not to go inside under any circumstances before we had a clean order. Dean had come out to get something from the trunk and spotted me standing at the curb. He stopped, then slammed the trunk shut with more force than was necessary. "What are you doing here, seeing how comfortable you still are living in a house you don't own?" Dean curled one side of his mouth into a smile. "Sophia wrote you a nice script. You do not own this house, and yet here I am. Temporarily." He came closer to the gate, hands in his coat pockets, carrying himself with the posture of a man who always needed to be in the higher position even if it was only by a single step. "You always loved the feeling of being the only one who really read the paperwork," he said. "But life doesn't run on who spots a footnote first." I looked at him. "And it doesn't run forever on your belief that Dad will clean up every consequence behind you." His smile flickered. "Just once, enough for me to know I had touched the right place." "You think this is about the house?" he said, his voice lower now. "No, you're trying to punish the family because for once someone told you no." I have to admit the line was sharp because it mixed in a sliver of truth. Yes, being thrown out of the house had struck something ancient in me, something that had spent too long already standing at the edge. But the deeper truth was that Dean needed to believe I was acting from hurt, rather than from right. Because if I was acting from right, then he was no longer the reasonable son managing the aftermath. He was a trespasser. "You're wrong in one place," I said. "I don't need anyone to apologize for me to know I'm right." Then I met his eyes. "You didn't lock me out of a house you own. You locked me out of a property you were hoping I wouldn't know how to reclaim." Dean laughed again, but it rang emptier this time. "See you in court." "Yes," I said. "For once, you're right." The weeks leading up to the hearing were the heaviest part of the whole story, not because I had nothing, but because too much began surfacing at once and each thing dragged a different kind of pain behind it. Sophia discovered that Dean was trying to use the house as collateral for a personal line to keep his company afloat, though the bank had put it on hold because of the title dispute. That gave motive a shape. They had not misunderstood. They did not merely want me out, because the atmosphere in the house had become unbearable. They needed me gone so the house could appear clean enough to borrow against or sell. Elaine, meanwhile, seemed to need liquidity too, and later it became clear why. Overspending and 2 other properties quietly bleeding cash. Neither of them was stupid. They were simply desperate enough to tell themselves that using soft power to force me out first and sort the paperwork later was reasonable. "They're not confused," Sophia said, tapping the wall-sized timeline we had built out of tape and printouts. "They're desperate. And once you understand that the other person is not lost but desperate, you stop waiting for their beautiful moment of remorse. You start preparing for how far they are willing to go if no one stops them." The hidden document, the one that truly snapped the spine of their legal position, surfaced from a place almost no one would have thought to look. A safe deposit box my father had once opened jointly with the family's first attorney long before Jonathan Pierce took over the full estate plan. That older lawyer, Arthur Blaine, had died 3 years earlier. His firm was gone. The files had been moved to storage. Most people would have stopped there, but Sophia had that useful, difficult temperament of people who never fully trust an old legal network to disappear cleanly. She tracked down Arthur's former administrative assistant, a woman named Maureen living in Milford, who had kept an index notebook for the archived boxes because, as she put it, Arthur never entirely trusted digitization. I met Maureen in a cramped living room that smelled of fabric softener and butter cookies, watched her run a trembly NG finger line by line down the notebook until she stopped at Mercer Residence, side instruction, not for marital file. We retrieved the box 3 days later. Under layers of old brown folders was a memo Arthur had written after meeting with my father 10 years earlier, stating clearly that Martin wanted the house placed into a segregated trust because, if I remarry, the residence must remain for Emma outright, not as a bargaining asset. There was also a handwritten letter from my father to Arthur, sent 2 months after marrying Elaine, in which he wrote, "If anything ever changes in the household, Emma is to have immediate authority over the property upon my incapacity or death. Elaine is never to be displaced unfairly, but she is not to own the residence. Not a will, not a direct conveyance instrument, but guidance entirely consistent with the trust, the tax writer, and everything else we already had." When Sophia finished reading, she said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she looked up. "This changes everything." I held the letter in my hands and felt no joy. Only my father returning through a sentence that sounded so much like him it hurt. Careful and kind, wanting to protect me, and yet still too polite about the risk named Elaine. That politeness had nearly killed me in this fight. The formal hearing took place in early March, after a dirty snowstorm had left the parking lot outside the county courthouse filled with gray ice and slush water. I wore a dark blue suit, my hair pinned low, My under-eye circles concealed more carefully than usual. Not because I wanted to look strong, because I did not want to look like someone they could call too emotional one more time. Elaine entered the courtroom in a camel wool coat and a single strand of pearls, widow by textbook. Dean walked beside her, his face sharpened by sleeplessness but still carrying the posture of a man who believed the world would not truly dare humiliate him in front of strangers. The relatives who had not returned my calls sat in the back row, stiff and polite, as though attending a performance too intimate to be proper and too compelling to miss. Judge Helen Ward was not the sort of woman easily manipulated by ritual. Mid-60s, fine-rimmed glasses, dry voice, with the habit of looking over an attorney's head for several seconds whenever she caught the smell of a lie dressed too elegantly. Sophia moved through the case, as if laying boards across a cracked floor. Trust certificate first, the deed into trust, the writer naming the successor trustee. Medical records, ICU timeline, metadata from the instrument scan, camera footage of Elaine carrying the file box down to the basement furnace room and returning with it empty. Elaine's lawyer objected, argued the footage did not show contents, that grief organizing is not fraud, that Martin retained broad authority. Then Sophia brought out my father's handwritten letter. No theatrics, just opened the folder, laid it down, moved for admission. In that cold room, where the rustle of paper sounded louder than normal, my father's handwriting suddenly became the most human thing in evidence. Elaine's side objected to provenance. Maureen testified Arthur's indexing system was authenticated. Chain of custody held clean. Their rhythm began to break. And when Sophia called the banker handling Dean's personal line and forced him to confirm that the house had been prepared as collateral while the title dispute was already active, motive surfaced fully. No longer protection of a widow, no longer practical estate management, just a man who needed money, and a house being used like reserve blood. The moment I knew we had one did not come when the judge made any formal finding. It came earlier, in Elaine's answer when Sophia questioned her directly. Sophia stood at the witness stand, her voice not rising by even a fraction. Mrs. Mercer, did Martin Mercer ever tell you this house was to belong to Emma? Elaine sat straight-backed, both hands folded. Her eyes delicately read the way people can make them after enough rehearsal in front of a mirror. He said many things to comfort her. That was not my question. He was ill. He was trying to keep peace. Sophia did not look away. Did he tell you the house belonged to Emma? Elaine went silent for 2 seconds. Dean looked down at the table. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath in that strange way legal rooms do, when the law is about to touch the ugliest part of human character. And then Elaine gave the final answer she still believed might save her. He was weak where she was concerned. Some sentences, the instant they are spoken, amount to a confession on the moral level even before the law names them. That was one of them. I stopped looking at her then. I looked directly at Judge Ward, because suddenly I no longer needed to hear anything else to know that Elaine's soft exterior had split open. Sophia rested her hand on the table, staring at the witness the way one stares at a door that has finally opened on its own. So your position, she said slowly, is that his repeated statements, his trust structure, his counsel instructions, and his handwritten letter should all be disregarded because you judged his affection for his daughter to be a weakness. Elaine opened her mouth. No words came. That was the moment politeness died. The ruling came down 5 days later. Elaine and Dean had no present ownership rights or valid beneficial interest sufficient to exclude me from the house. The instrument they had relied upon was not credible, both because of the timing and competency conflicts, and because it could not overcome the trust structure that had already existed. Judge Ward did not merely restore my right of access. She used exactly the kind of language someone like Elaine hates most. Clear, sharp, without adornment, changing the locks and excluding me from the house, in circumstances where they lacked lawful possessory authority, was deemed the wrongful exclusion of a beneficial owner. Elaine and Dean were barred from transferring, mortgaging, or interfering with my return. A separate review track was opened regarding the submission of unreliable documents to the court. There was no cheering. No one hugged me in the courtroom. Nora squeezed my hand. Sophia closed the folder. Elaine sat motionless, staring straight ahead, and for the first time in months, her hands had to clench hard enough for the knuckles to white. Dean turned to me as everyone rose, his eyes dark and flat, stripped of every trace of the reasonable brother mask. "Happy?" he asked softly. I looked at him. No, it was the truest thing I had at that moment, because justice never arrives like pain medication. It is only an order to stop. The pain itself remains in the blood. I returned to the house on a Monday morning so clear it felt cruel. The local police were present, because Sophia wanted absolutely no room for further interpretation about unlawful entry. The locksmith removed the new hardware. The front door opened with the small, familiar sound I had heard thousands of times in my life. And for the first instant, my body truly believed what it had wanted so desperately for so long, that everything would somehow be restored. But houses do not give people back whole. The smell inside had changed. Not mildew, not dust. The smell of another person having lived long enough to press her own residue into curtain seams, sofa fabric, tea tin. A few paintings had been moved. The silver tray my mother used to keep on the front console was gone. The 3 books my father always stacked on the table beside his armchair had disappeared. In the study, the left drawer had been reorganized in a way no one but Elaine would ever have thought logic. In the kitchen, the blue ceramic vase my mother bought in Vermont had been banished to the garage. I walked through every room as though moving through a scene of invasion that was over on paper, but still intact in every small detail. On the landing of the stairs, I had to stop, because my legs would not carry me any farther. Not because I was happy, because I understood I had regained a physical place, without any possibility of recovering its earlier moral innocence. "Take your time," Sophia said quietly behind me. I nodded, but in my head a sentence had already begun to take shape, ruthless and precise. They had not only tried to drive me out, they had proved that even home, once tied to money and desperation, can become a battlefield like anything else. Elaine moved out 2 days later without seeing me. Her lawyer arranged a schedule for collecting her personal item. Dean tried to drag things out, tried to haggle over a few objects, tried to convert humiliation into one last negotiation. But once his line with the bank was shut and his company began to split at the seams, even he had to understand the house was no longer a place to play cards. I heard through others that they were renting a smaller townhouse in Greenwich while liquidating other pieces. A few relatives never called again. A few sent cards whose apologies were too polite to become actual apologies. Martha came back for 3 weeks to help me go through the rooms, then hugged me at the back door before leaving for Florida with her daughter. "Your mother would have torn the roof off that woman," she said. I laughed and cried for the first time since the hearing, not because the sentence made me lighter, because at last someone had named my anger in a way that didn't make it sound like instability. Nora stayed with me the first weekend. We drank wine in the kitchen, barefoot on the wood floor, watching the sunset slide across the table where I once ate cereal after school and later signed the petition that got me back inside. "You won," Nora said. I looked at the kitchen, at the basil plant I had bought and set on the sill, at the pale wash of light on the glass. "Yeah," I said, but inside, victory sounded emptier than outsiders imagine, because the cost isn't in legal fees or lost sleep. It's in no longer being able to cross this threshold as the daughter who once believed home was something that didn't need proof. Months later, when spring leaned into summer and the hydrangeas by the porch had begun to turn pale blue, I received a handwritten letter with no signature, sent by post, in a careful slanted script I recognized immediately despite every effort to forget it. Elaine wrote briefly, and for the first time did not use words like love or family. She only said that I had won the structure, but not the story, and that one day I would understand how caring for a man as he grew old, frail, and difficult over the last years of his life could make a person terrified of losing her place. I sat at the kitchen table reading the letter in early afternoon light, and the most frightening thing was that I truly did understand part of it. Not enough to forgive her, but enough to see that the most subtle evil rarely grows out of emptiness. It grows out of fear braided to greed, out of the feeling that one has invested too much to leave empty-handed, out of living for too long inside a house that is not yours until mere presence begins to feel like ownership. I burned the letter in the metal planter on the porch, not because I wanted to erase her from my life, but because I had finally learned something I should have learned far earlier. Understanding the motives of the person who harms you does not obligate you to save them from the consequences. If someone asked me what the worst part of all this was, I would not say the hearing, or the new lock, or the boxes on the porch, though those images are still pinned inside my mind with undiminished sharpness. The worst part was the stretch in the middle, when I had to live inside the gap between what I knew and what the well-mannered world around me was willing to believe. When my stepmother used a gentle voice to turn my memory into something emotional and unreliable. When my brother looked me in the eye and called my love for the house attachment. When relatives chose the widow with the better posture over the daughter who was shaking, because she had been erased from the place where she had scrubbed floors, changed light bulbs, kept the visiting nurse schedule, and sat beside the bed of her dying father. That is the real violence of people who manipulate well. Not that they take from you instantly, but that they make your resistance sound like pathology. They use order to make you look like chaos. And if you don't have enough documents, enough time, enough stamina, enough legal help, you begin to doubt the floor beneath your own feet. I almost did. There were mornings when I sat in the car outside the county office parking lot, hands fixed on the steering wheel, and honestly couldn't remember whether I was fighting for a clear truth or for a promise I had romanticized because I was in too much pain. Maybe that's why when I won, I didn't feel saved. I only felt confirmed as not insane. And sometimes, for those who have been gaslit for long enough, that alone is an expensive kind of miracle. I still live in the house now, not as a trophy, but as a fact that has been litigated. I changed a few locks, installed a new camera system, stored the documents in my own safe, redesigned the garden plan the way I wanted it, and it took me exactly 1 year before I could sleep in the primary bedroom instead of my old room at the end of the hall. There are nights when I go downstairs for water and still hear Elaine in my head. The house is an asset, not a shrine. There are mornings when the light falls across the dining table exactly as it did when my father was alive, and my chest tightens, because he did not protect this cleanly enough for me to be spared the courtroom. I no longer resent him in a childish way. I only understand something harder now about men like my father. They believe a private promise is strong enough to hold back a system as long as the person hearing it is a good daughter. They do not understand that some women will come in with white gloves on and turn that whole system inside out if there is enough empty space and enough polite people willing to look away. Sometimes, late in the day, I stand on the back porch looking across the rose garden, watching the shadow of the house stretch long over the grass. And I know with absolute clarity that what I got back was not an earlier version of safety. It was the right to remain after someone tried to erase me. Those two things look similar from a distance, but living inside them is nothing alike. If I had to shorten the story for people who prefer neat endings, I could say this. My stepmother tried to take the house my father left me after he died, changed the locks, produced slippery documents, pushed me out. But then an old trust, a handwritten letter, metadata, camera footage, and a judge who wasn't fooled by a soft voice pull the truth back into place. All of that is true. The full story does not live in the legal reversal. It lives in the fact that they thought throwing me off the porch would be enough to turn me into an outsider, both on paper and in memory. It lives in the fact that they forced me to learn the very thing I had always hated: how to turn pain into records, memory into evidence, instinct into timeline, familial betrayal into a structure tight enough for the law to touch. They thought changing the lock was the end. They thought a new deadbolt and a few lines delivered in the right tone would be enough to make me doubt myself and retreat. What they did not understand is that when a house is truly yours, you do not go back simply because you are sentimentally attached. You go back because you cannot go on living if someone is allowed to define you as excess at the threshold of the place that made you. They thought they kicked me out of my own home. In truth, all they did was prove, through violence, that I belonged there more deeply than they ever understood. And the final cost of proving that was that I could never again walk through the front door with the old innocence intact. The court gave me the house back. What it could not return was the version of me who once believed only strangers could lock you out of your own home.